Last June, 19 firefighters died while battling a 500-acre fire in central Arizona. While investigators try to piece together the mystery of what went wrong, the Yarnell Hill Fire has become emblematic of just how powerful and unpredictable wildfires have become in the United States. Here to discuss the evolution of wildfires and why they've become so dangerous is John Dougherty. He is an investigative journalist. He's covering the Yarnell Hill Fire, and he is the founder of investigativemedia.com. We also have Michael Kotis, Associate Director of the Center for Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado. He's also the author of the upcoming book, Megafire. And we're joined by Stephen Pine, a professor of life sciences at Arizona State University, also the author of the book, Fire, Nature, and Culture. In studio, we're joined by Greg Gilderman. He's Executive Director of Digital Video for the Weather Channel. I want to thank you for being here.
It's great to be here.
All right, everybody in the Google Hangout as well, thank you for joining us. I want to start by showing a clip from the fire that you helped produce here for the Weather Channel. It's about, it's a documentary. It's about the Yarnell Hill Fire. Let's take a look.
There's a problem that the nation needs to look at trying to solve. Fires are getting bigger and more extreme. Since the South Canyon fire in '94, there have been 400 wildland firefighters killed and 40,000 homes lost.
He sent me a text message going to a 500-acre fire in Yarnell, and that was the last time I heard from him.
Granite Mountain 7!
Is Granite Mountain still in there?
I could just see all these wives just crying.
Your escape route has been cut off. We are preparing a deployment site.
I found out that people that I loved died.
Wow, powerful stuff. Greg, 19 firefighters died in that blaze. Is that unprecedented?
Well, we have some of the foremost fire historians with us now. I believe there was a much larger, of course, there was 9/11, and also in 1933, a large number of firefighters died. But it was the single most deadliest day for firefighters since 9/11.
Wow, that's stunning. And obviously 9/11, a different kind of circumstance that we sort of make sense of, as tragic and awful as it is. We sort of make sense of it as a particular type of incident, an incident of terrorism. This seems a bit different, and I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate just how commonplace and how dangerous these types of circumstances are.
Yeah, and that's what surprised us as well. Initially, we were just going to try to tell a very intimate and emotional narrative about what happened to the 19 firefighters and do as much fact-finding around that story as possible. But as we looked at the larger picture of wildfires in the United States, we saw that this was also a story about climate change. It's a story about where we're building houses and the materials we're building them out of, and frankly, the circumstances that we put wildland firefighters in to battle firefighters that maybe we shouldn't be putting them in.
Let me go back to that incident that day, because you talk about origins and causes. How do 19 trained firefighters end up surrounded by fire in that way?
Wow, well, I think I'm going to defer to John Dougherty on this.
Fair enough.
There's really no one who knows better than the actual chronology, and I'm happy to see he was able to join us. He participated in the documentary and was a consulting producer on it.
Absolutely, John. So let me start then. What went wrong that day?
Well, a number of things went wrong. Primarily, I think the most important issue was that the state of Arizona did not deploy sufficient resources and sufficient management to oversee the operations of the fire, and they lost direct contact with the Granite Mountain hotshot crew during a very critical time in the day when the fire conditions were changing rapidly, and the crew made some decisions to move from a safe zone into an unburned area while changing conditions were escalating, and the crew was entrapped by the flames in a rather devastating scenario. But I think the bottom line was just really poorly mismanaged operations from the beginning of the fire throughout the whole 3 days of the fire, culminating in their deaths.
Wow. The interesting thing is that this isn't just happening in Arizona. Just this month alone, we've seen blazes devour Southern California, Colorado. In Arkansas, forecasters are predicting an intense wildfire season, despite the fact that the state is currently seeing frigid temperatures, Greg, I'm not sure we fully can wrap our minds around just how pervasive these fires are.
They're absolutely pervasive, and one of the things that's changed fundamentally is the way that we treat fire, and it varies from state to state. But for many, many decades, we allowed certain fires to burn, and that would clear out some of the most flammable and dangerous.
Give me an example,
materials.
because to the average person, that seems counterintuitive.
Sure. Well, if you allow a fire to burn, it'll clear out pine needles, brush, some of the stuff that's sort of like kindling. If you suppress fires, if you send wildland firefighters out to put out every fire that gets started, not only does that damage the ecology, there are some trees and plants that grow because there are fires, it also results in all of these highly flammable and dangerous materials building up, and then with a combination of hot summers, high winds, and also dry winters, you see these fires very quickly spiral out of control.
So it's a matter, in some sense, of striking a balance between letting the sort of ecosystem naturally do what it does, which is, at times means producing fires, but also managing it so that you don't have devastating impacts not just on the wildlife, but on the broader human community.
That's absolutely right. And I think one of the points we try to raise in this documentary is that, well, if you allow the amount of real estate development we've allowed in certain parts of the country, there's almost no turning back, because you're either, if you allow the fire to burn, you're going to risk a great deal of property, and there are a lot of people who, even if that property is empty, are not interested in having that happen. On the other side of that discussion, our wildland firefighters will say, hey, why are you putting us in this position where we are defending with our lives an empty vacation home?
Right, which totally makes sense. Steve, I want to bring you into the conversation because there seems to have been some level of shift between how we think about firefighting techniques, and even the sort of ideologies around when fires should be put out and how they should be put out. Those shifts seem to have occurred over the past few decades. We don't do it now the way we used to. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, yes and no. I think the modern era really begins in 1910, following a catastrophic wave of fires in the Northern Rockies. 78 firefighters died in one afternoon. And that really shocked the system. We spent the next 50 years trying to put out all fires. That failed. We've spent the last 50 years trying to find some way to put it back in. And in fact, the restoration project is working in the sense that fires are coming back. They're just not coming back in the way we want, or the kind we want. And I think now the sense I read out of most of the fire community is that we've lost control of it. We're not going to get ahead of it. We can protect particular communities, particular assets, but otherwise we're really moving from restoration to resilience. How are we going to survive the stuff that's coming at us? Because we're not going to be able to be proactive enough to get ahead of it.
Michael, I want to talk about another thing here, and that is climate change. The conversations about global warming, the conversations about climate change, they seem to impact. I'll give you an example. I was looking here at 120 degrees in Prescott, Arizona, the temperature was when the Yarnell Hill Fire was started. Stuff like that has to matter, right?
Yeah, it matters a great deal, and on a number of different levels. One impact here in Colorado, where I live, and also in Arizona and many other western areas, is that snowpack melts off much earlier in the year. Many areas are getting less snow during the winter, and when the temperatures warm up, that snow vanishes much earlier in the year than it used to. That snowpack up on the top of mountains is kind of like a trickle irrigation system for forests. And so a lot of the fires that we've seen here in Colorado, and keep in mind, we, as of last year, had broken our most destructive fire record in Colorado 4 times in 4 years. And we are seeing fires in March when normally we'd have a lot of snow on the ground. We had a fire in 2012 that was dealing with the problem we just discussed about overgrown forests, where we reintroduced fire. The Colorado Forest Service reintroduced fire in an area that normally would be safe to do that in March, and instead they lost control of that prescribed burn. It destroyed 23 homes and killed 3 people in the neighborhood adjacent to the area they were trying to fix. So climate presents a lot of dangers in that regard. We're seeing really unusual fires right now in California, and globally we're seeing this. Australia just had a series of very destructive fires, and also just had their hottest year on record last year.
Wow. Comments coming in from the HuffPost Live community. Nikon writes in and says, I am in Colorado, so wildfires is one of our seasons. While I have not checked the data, it does feel like we have had more fires in recent years than in decades past. My best guess is more people plus living in forested areas plus prevention efforts equals continue the problem we have now. My city is currently unable to pay our, quote, old hire firefighters their pensions after next year, and our active firefighters have to hold boot drives at intersections to pay for their gear now. So we're looking at resource problems, ecological problems. There's the obviously political economic challenges of expanding, urban areas and suburban areas. This seems to be a super challenge. I'm glad you all are putting some spotlight on it. I have a question, though, before you all go. One is a very practical question that many people out there are probably asking, which is, are there areas that are not prone to wildfires now that may be prone sooner than later?
Yeah.
Boy, that's an interesting question. I think I would defer to Mr. Kotis on that one.
Yes.
Predicting what climate is going to do to fire is an incredibly difficult science, but there definitely seems to be changes in the fire regimes of areas where we will see an increase in fire. And one aspect of it that's a little counterintuitive, if you look at climate models, we're looking at areas that are going to get drier and hotter, and you would expect to have more fire there.
Indeed.
We're also looking at some areas that are going to get wetter, and among some of those areas that are going to get wetter, there's also an anticipation that we might get more fire, because if you're in an area that is normally pretty dry and you get what they call a precipitation pulse as the climate changes, that can drive a green up, a lot more vegetation in that landscape. And when that landscape returns to a drier condition, then you have more fuel to burn in the fires that might ignite there.
Wow, heavy stuff. Thank you all for joining us. It's a great conversation, and importantly, it's a great documentary, and I'm glad that it's being done, because this is something that many of us, myself included, didn't know a lot about. But the more I hear about it, the more compelling an argument it is for taking this stuff seriously and for really making a better understanding of how we can interact and engage the environment. This is great stuff. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you all for joining us in the Google Hangout, and thank you all for leaving your comments. I want you to keep your comments coming in, because there are so many questions to be asked, so many insights to be offered, many of which will be answered through our resource well, and most importantly through this awesome documentary. Stay with us at HuffPost Live. Much more coming up.